What happens when power is mistaken for superiority and intellect is mistaken for position? It was a quiet Monday morning at Millstone High, the kind where even the wind seemed cautious. The early sun poured soft gold across the weathered brick walls, while a few early students trickled into the courtyard, their sneakers squeaking against dew-slick concrete. The air carried the sleepy murmurs of a new week starting, but none of them knew it would end with their entire understanding of respect, race, and intellect forever changed. At the heart of that courtyard, beneath the school's weathered bulletin board, stood Miss Caroline Ellison, a sharp-featured woman in her early 60s, with immaculately pinned silver hair and a wardrobe that screamed discipline. She was known across campus as the Queen of Numbers. Her 30-year reign as the school's premier calculus teacher was built not just on credentials, but on the unspoken belief that she was always the smartest person in any room. She held, in her manicured hand, a single white sheet of paper. Crisp, calculated, like her voice. With great care, she pinned it to the board. Then she turned, adjusted her navy blazer, and scanned the growing crowd of curious students. There was a sparkle in her eye, not of generosity, but of dominance. "This," she said, her voice cutting through the courtyard like a ruler slapped against a desk, "is not just any equation. It's a challenge, a real one, for minds brave enough to think beyond the textbook." The page displayed a monster of a math problem, a triple integral tangled in non-linear transformations, obscure symbols, and hidden constraints. It was the kind of problem that even a graduate student might hesitate to tackle. Caroline didn't expect anyone to solve it. That was the point. A few students chuckled nervously, already sensing defeat. "Solve it by Friday," she said with a razor-edged smile, "and I'll buy you real pizza. Extra cheese." Laughter rippled across the courtyard, but beneath the surface it was clear. This wasn't mentorship. It was performance, a power play cloaked in intellectual superiority. And then, as the crowd began to break apart, Caroline noticed movement at the edge of the square. A woman in a faded navy uniform was emptying a mop bucket into the courtyard drain. Her back slightly bent, hair tucked under a gray scarf, she moved quietly, almost invisibly. Her name was Angela Brooks, 47, a new hire in the school's custodial team, barely 3 weeks into the job. Most students didn't even know her name. But Caroline saw her now, because Angela had paused. She was a movie. She was staring, not glancing, not idly watching like someone passing time. She was studying the board. Her eyes moved along the equations slowly, deliberately, with the same kind of focus Caroline had seen only in her top-performing students. A flicker of something passed through Caroline's expression. Cold. I think she tilted her head toward the crowd, raising her voice with mock delight. "Well, would you look at that? Even the cleaning staff's intrigued. Isn't that charming?" Some of the students laughed. Others shifted uncomfortably. Angela didn't look away. Her hand still rested on the mop handle, but her mind was somewhere else, far deeper than the polished floor beneath her feet. "Oh, don't tell me," Caroline continued, her smile now curving like a blade. "You'd like to try it too?" Another chuckle. Another layer of condescension folded into a voice that claimed to be encouraging but dripped with assumption. Angela said nothing, but her eyes narrowed just slightly. And then something subtle changed. The moment stopped feeling playful. It began to feel pointed, unjust. One student lowered his phone. Another adjusted her backpack. The tone had turned. The air had shifted. Caroline either didn't notice, or she did and reveled in it. She turned back to the board, tapped the paper with satisfaction, and said under her breath, "Let's see who dares." Her heels clicked sharply as she walked away. Behind her, Angela stood still. The sun had shifted. Its light caught the edge of the chalkboard, throwing long shadows across the ground. The mop in Angela's hand suddenly felt heavier, not because of its weight, but because of everything it symbolized. And inside her, something stirred. Not ambition, not defiance. She looked at the equation again, and in the quietest voice, barely audible, she whispered, "I know this." That moment didn't explode. It unfolded quietly, steadily, like dawn. But something was changing. Angela Brooks wasn't who they thought she was. And neither was this just a math problem. This was history knocking on the door of the present. And she was about to open it. Before we dive into the full story, take a deep breath. Maybe pour yourself a warm cup of tea or coffee. Make sure you're sitting comfortably. Because what you're about to hear is not just about math. It's about what we fail to see when we choose to look only at the surface. Get ready for a story of silence, brilliance, and the moment one woman refused to stay invisible any longer. And the morning air inside the courtyard of Wexley High was crisp, with the quiet energy of a day not yet begun. Most of the students were still filing in, the sound of backpacks swinging, sneakers scraping against concrete, and low murmurs humming under the early autumn breeze. But Grace Taylor, 43, hair tucked neatly under a gray scarf, pushing her mop cart, was already part of the background, a familiar blur no one really saw. That's the role she had learned to play for years. Present, but invisible. Until that morning. Mrs. Clarice Ellison, a stately woman in her mid-50s, heels polished and blazer starched within an inch of its life, strode across the courtyard like she owned the place, because in a way she did. With 3 teaching awards, a best-selling academic paper, and a reputation for crushing classroom confidence with a single raised eyebrow, Mrs. Ellison was both admired and feared, especially by those who didn't know how to stay in her good graces. With the poise of a performer who'd rehearsed every movement, she pinned a sheet of white paper onto the school's central announcement board. She didn't need to say anything. Just her presence was enough to draw a small crowd of students, mostly AP kids, a few curious freshmen, and 1 or 2 teachers hovering at the fringe. Then she turned and smiled. "This," she said, tapping the paper gently, as if revealing a sacred artifact, "is not just any equation. It is a challenge, one that separates memorization from mastery." The paper displayed a tangled mass of triple integrals, multidimensional calculus transforms, and boundary conditions as obscure as the Russian winter. Even the top math students leaned in, their eyes squinting, already intimidated. "If anyone solves it by Friday," Clarice added, letting the pause stretch for dramatic effect, "I'll spring for pizza, real pizza, extra cheese." The students laughed, a little nervously. She knew none of them would solve it. That was the point. She wanted to remind them who sat at the top of the intellectual food chain. But what she didn't expect, what no one expected, was the woman with the mop to stop. Across the courtyard, Grace paused mid-swipe. Her fingers tightened around the handle. Her eyes, those quiet, watchful eyes, rose and fixed themselves on the board. Not in passing, not by accident, but with a focus so still, so deliberate, that even Clarice noticed. Something flickered across Clarice's face, discomfort disguised as a smile. "Well," she called out loudly enough for the students to hear, "even our janitorial staff seems intrigued. Isn't that charming?" The air shifted. A few students chuckled, unsure if they were allowed to laugh. Others looked away, sensing the cut beneath the comment. Clarice kept her smile as she turned back toward Grace. Would you like to try it? She asked, eyes glinting with mock sweetness. I admire ambition, even when it's misplaced. Silence followed. Grace didn't move. Her hand still rested on the mop handle, her spine straight. The courtyard faded around her as memories surged, so fast and vivid they almost knocked the wind out of her. She was 16 again, standing under the harsh lights of a regional math competition stage. Second-place medal. Her mother coughing in the front row, oxygen tank hissing softly. She was supposed to go further. She was supposed to become more, but that was before everything collapsed. She looked at the board now. Not like a janitor, not like someone beneath it, but like someone who remembered, who understood. And though she said nothing, something in her eyes responded. I remember this. Sure, Clarice blinked. She hadn't spoken, but that look, that defiant steadiness, echoed louder than words. A few students turned to Cleese now, not to laugh with her, but to gauge her. There was something uncomfortable in the way she held her posture, a twitch at the corner of her mouth, the sharp edge of superiority dulled ever so slightly. Clarisse turned away with a scoff, patting the corner of the pinned sheet like sealing a royal decree. Let's see who's brave enough, she muttered and walked off. Behind her, Grace remained still, but inside her, something cracked open. She didn't know exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the equation, maybe it was the memory, or maybe it was just the right amount of silence, finally interrupted. And her heart whispered it before her voice did. I can solve this. The mop stood leaning against the wall, forgotten. By the time lunch hour rolled around, the myth of the equation had already taken hold. Students snapped photos, tried to parse the symbols, whispered theories in clusters like it was an urban legend. I don't know. And Grace? She kept mopping the hall outside the cafeteria, kept pushing the cart like nothing was different. But it was. Lie their chest. Something old had reawakened. Not ambition, not pride, but something more fragile. Something like belonging. As the afternoon sun slanted through the arched windows of Roosevelt High's central quad, casting golden rays across concrete tiles, still damp from morning dew, the courtyard had become something else entirely. An arena of eyes, murmurs, and underestimation. Lunch trays had been abandoned, conversations silenced mid-sentence, and the usual buzzing energy now hummed with suspense. At the heart of it all stood Grace Whitman, 41, her janitor uniform streaked faintly with dust and bleach, her hair still tucked beneath a faded scarf. But today, she wasn't dragging a mop across linoleum floors. She was standing motionless before the whiteboard, chalk between her fingers, steady as steel behind her. Mrs. Diana Ellison, 57, the school's most respected and feared calculus teacher, clutched her coffee cup a little too tightly. The sting of her earlier ridicule still echoed in the air like a slap no one dared name. Diana had set the stage. What she hadn't expected was that her joke would summon a storm she couldn't control. The whiteboard bore the same monstrous equation Diana had pinned there that morning, a triple integral with non-linear boundaries, a mathematical beast dressed to intimidate. But now it was about to meet a force just as exact, just as elegant. Grace moved. Well, it was a letter. Right. Her hand rose with a kind of calm that doesn't come from confidence, but from memory, lived experience, and a quiet mastery, honed in forgotten libraries and moonlit bedrooms where dreams were once whispered. The chalk kissed the board. A single stroke, then another. Sharp, fluid lines bloomed across the surface like music notes being rewritten after decades of silence. She didn't flinch. She didn't pause. Each segment of the equation unraveled beneath her hand, sectioned with the clarity of someone who had long stopped second-guessing their brilliance. Now the girl in the crowd whispered, "She knows exactly what she's doing," and the silence that followed felt almost reverent. One boy's water bottle rolled off the bench unnoticed. Another had his phone half raised but forgot to press record, too stunned by what he was witnessing. Mrs. Ellison stood frozen, the earlier smugness in her smile now warping into disbelief, confusion, and something deeper. Fear. Because this wasn't just a solution, this was a reclamation. From behind Grace, a freshman boy slowly sat down, as though standing in her presence demanded a different posture. Two senior girls, best friends, known more for gossip than grades, clutched each other's sleeves. "And Diana?" She began to step forward, ever so slowly, as if being drawn towards something sacred. A strong gust of wind swept through the courtyard, flapping the hem of Grace's faded shirt. Dust from the mop bucket she'd abandoned an hour earlier lifted gently in the air. "And still," she wrote. Then came a small but piercing voice. A 10th grader no one had paid much attention to before. "She's not solving it, she's teaching it." It was true. Her movements weren't hurried or performative. They were instructional, composed, generous. As though, even in this moment of vindication, she was offering a lesson, not a spectacle. Soon, a powerful image emerged as her hand moved with finality across the board, placing the closing mark at the end of a perfectly simplified expression. Q-E-D. She dropped the chalk. It clinked softly against the ledge, and then her eyes met Diana's. For a brief second, everything else vanished. The students, the buzzing phones, the judgment, the heat of the sun. Just the two of them, standing on opposite ends of a battlefield neither had intended to fight on that day. Grace didn't raise her chin in triumph. She didn't smirk or boast. Instead, she said, quietly, but with piercing clarity, it wasn't about solving it. It was about proving Matadosh. I never forgot how that line cracked something invisible open. Diana's fingers loosened around her cup. It slipped slightly, spilling coffee down her white blouse, but she didn't move to clean it. Her breath caught as realization set in, not just that she'd been wrong, but that her ignorance had cost her the dignity of another human being. The students, they didn't cheer, not yet. There was still awe in the air, something more sacred than applause. Grace stepped away from the board. She didn't walk fast. Her pace was measured, like someone walking out of the past and into herself again. She passed by a sophomore girl with braids who reached out instinctively, not to stop her, but just to touch her sleeve. Grace glanced down, nodded, and kept moving. The mob she'd left leaned against a wall nearby. She didn't pick it up. Not today. The courtyard, only moments ago electric with whispers and awe, had begun to return to motion. Shuffling feet, murmured voices, the occasional startled laugh of someone trying to release the tension still lingering in the air. But then, just as Grace Whitman turned from the board, just as her hand brushed the last of the chalk dust from her fingers, a different kind of silence fell. Not the hush of respect, not the chill of shock. This was a pause pulled taut by authority. The double doors at the far end of the school swung open. Principal, Malcolm Brooks, tall, silver-haired, his navy blazer slightly rumpled at the shoulders from years of use and battles won without shouting, stepped into view. The man was known for his restraint, for his fairness, and for having a voice that only rose when silence failed. He walked with the steady rhythm of someone who had just been called into something important and already knew he was late. His eyes scanned the crowd, He saw the cluster of students frozen in place, the whiteboard still alive with the full, precise solution, and standing just slightly apart, facing the aftermath with quiet grace, was the woman whose name had never been announced during morning roll call because she wasn't listed on it. "Someone want to tell me," Brooks asked calmly, "what exactly just happened here?" There was a pause. No one answered, until a hand rose. Jada Wynn, a senior in AP Calculus, barely 5 feet tall but known for her unshakable voice, stepped forward. She was still holding her phone in one hand, but her eyes were locked on the principal's with a steadiness that caught even Mrs. Ellison off guard. "She solved the problem, sir," Jada said. "The one Mrs. Ellison posted this morning. The Ms. Whitman. She solved it." Brooks blinked. Slowly, his gaze moved to the board. He didn't speak, he didn't move for several long seconds. Then he walked toward it. His eyes scanned each step of the solution, his jaw tightening not in skepticism, but in concentration. The method was complex, elegant, innovative, not a classroom trick, but a mathematician's instinct applied with laser clarity. He turned back to Grace. "You solved this?" he asked, his tone neutral but undeniably focused. Grace nodded once. "I did. Where did you learn this?" he asked. There was no accusation in his voice, only curiosity tempered with something else, the beginning of respect. Grace exhaled. "I was accepted to Ohio State's applied mathematics program when I was 17, she said. Placed second at the Midwest Regional Olympiad the same year. I was preparing for nationals when my mother got sick, stage IV lung cancer. I left before my first semester started. A few students audibly gasped, not out of pity, but because the pieces were clicking into place. And you've been working since then? Brooks asked, softer now. He nodded again. Cleaning, working nights, taking care of what I had to. Brooks didn't respond right away. He looked at the board again, then at Mrs. Ellison, who stood as if pinned in place, her usually sharp features unreadable now. Clarice, Brooks said without looking at her, is the solution correct? Mary Ellison stepped forward slowly. Her heels clicked against the concrete, each step louder than it needed to be. She stood before the board, scanned the lines she had once used to mock someone, and swallowed visibly. Yes, she said at last, her voice quieter than usual. It's correct? Thoroughly. Brooks nodded once, then looked back at Grace. I'm going to be honest with you, he said. We've been struggling to find a new faculty advisor for our math club. The last one left at the start of the year. I know this is sudden and far from official, but if you'd be willing, I'd like to recommend you for that role. Grace blinked. The words hit her, not like an opportunity, but like a memory return, something she hadn't even allowed herself to hope for in years. I don't have a degree, she said quietly. Not on paper. Brooks gave a half smile. You have proof of concept. That's more than some with diplomas can offer. He stepped closer, offering his hand, not as a gesture of reward, but as an invitation. Let me make some calls. We can start small. Advisor work, maybe some tutoring. And from there, who knows? The district still offers continuing education grants. You've done more than enough to qualify. Marsh hesitated, then took his hand. Around them, students didn't cheer, they didn't clap, but their stillness said everything. The girl with braids, who had earlier touched Grace's sleeve, reached into her bag and pulled out a notebook, offering it shyly. Could you maybe show us how you broke down the middle part? I didn't get that substitution step. Grace blinked at the request. Her fingers brushed the notebook's cover. And for the first time in over 2 decades, she felt it again. Not the pressure of proving herself, not the weight of surviving, but the lightness of being useful, as she was meant to be. She nodded. "Of course," she said softly. "That part's the trickiest." Hot, the moment held. Then the bell rang, and yet no one moved. Because something greater than a class schedule had just begun. The silence that followed Principal Brooks' words was not empty. It was sacred. It held the weight of decades, of dreams paused, of a woman's quiet brilliance buried under years of mops and forgotten classrooms. Grace Taylor, standing there in her worn uniform, still dusted with chalk, was no longer just a custodian in the eyes of the students. She was a revelation. And then, with the crowd still buzzing, Principal Brooks turned to her once more, his voice measured but resolute. "Grace," he said, drawing her name out like it deserved to be heard fully. "Would you be interested in doing more than cleaning these halls?" A hush fell again, deeper this time. Grace blinked, slowly, unsure if her ears had truly caught the question. For so long no one had asked her what she wanted to do, only what she needed to finish. "Sir?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I mean it," Brooks continued. "The math club's been leaderless since last year. We've had no luck finding anyone with the right heart and head for it. I can't offer a professor's salary, but I can work with the district to offer a stipend. Maybe even help you apply for a continuing education scholarship, if that's something you'd want." Grace didn't respond immediately. Her hands, still dusted in white, clenched softly at her sides. Her mind flashed back to a time when she held scholarship letters in both hands, and her mother's frail fingers gripped her wrist, whispering, "We'll find a way. We always do." But they hadn't. Life had made different decisions. She swallowed. "I'd like that," she said finally, her voice clear and simple. And yet it echoed in that courtyard like a declaration. Brooks gave a small nod, one of approval and promise. "Then let's make that happen." As he turned to go, the crowd of students dispersed in slow, rippling motion, as if they too had witnessed the universe gently shift. And there, by the board still holding her elegant solution, Grace stood alone once more. But not for long. From a distance a figure emerged. Martha Ellison. Her stride lacked its earlier confidence. Gone was the stiff poise of superiority. In its place was something softer, more human. She stepped up to Grace quietly, and without meeting her eyes at first, she said, "I misjudged you. I'm sorry." Grace turned slowly, looking at the woman who had once tried to make her small. "I'm not angry," Grace replied, her tone gentle but firm. "You saw what you were taught to see." Those words, simple and unadorned, sliced deeper than any retort. For the first time in a long time, Martha had no clever comeback, only a small nod. She stepped back and walked away. Not defeated, but undeniably changed. Later that night, Grace stood in the quiet hallway outside the faculty lounge. The school was nearly empty, the scent of disinfectant lingering in the air. Her cart remained untouched. She had not come to clean. Pinned to the board beside her was a new flyer. Its ink was still fresh. Math Club Revival. Led by Ms. Grace Taylor. Mondays and Wednesdays, all levels, welcome. Her name. Bold. Public. No longer hidden behind a badge or tucked into a payroll file. She reached out and touched the corner of the paper. Her fingers trembled slightly. Not from fear, but from awe. It had been so long. Footsteps echoed down the hall. "And I wasn't sure if you'd still be here," Principal Brooks said, walking toward her, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, a folder in one hand. "I had to see it again," Grace replied without turning. He handed her the folder. Inside were neatly printed documents. Recommendation letters, district forms, a scholarship nomination, already signed. "They don't usually move this fast," Brooks said with a faint smile, "but after I told them about today, showed them the footage, your background, your solution, they didn't need convincing." Grace flipped through the pages slowly, her eyes welled, but no tears fell. "They want to offer you a continuing education scholarship," Brooks added gently. "Full coverage. And we'll make your current work here a formal assistant teaching role. Just part-time for now, tutoring, club leadership. But if you want more, we'll make room." Grace exhaled, long and slow. "When I left school at 17, she said, her voice catching for the first time, I told myself I wouldn't let that part of me disappear, that I'd come back. But after a while, I stopped believing there was a door left to knock on." Brooks didn't respond right away. He just listened. "And then today," she said, looking up at him, "someone opened it." He met her eyes with quiet certainty. "It's still your door, Grace. Always was." She nodded. From down the hallway, another set of footsteps. Martha appeared again, clutching a few old books. "I heard you stayed late," she said, stopping a few feet away. "He is," Grace replied. Martha hesitated, then held out the books. "These are from the old math archives. Some of the techniques you used today. I never fully grasped them. I figured maybe we could talk through them sometime, if you're willing." Grace looked at the stack, then at Martha's face, and saw something new, a flicker of humility. "I'm willing," she said. Martha let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Good." She turned to leave. "Mrs. Ellison," Grace called after her. Matcha turned. "I hope you'll come to the math club." A pause, and then a real smile. "I just might." That night, Grace stood once more by the flyer. The halls were still. The name on the paper no longer looked foreign. It looked right. She reached down, picked up a piece of chalk she had tucked into her pocket hours ago, and walked quietly to an empty classroom. No audience, no challenge, just her. She stood at the board and began to write again. Not because someone doubted her, but because, for the first time in years, she didn't doubt herself. The first Monday afternoon meeting of the newly revived Hamilton High Math Club was meant to be small, quiet, just a handful of curious students gathering after school, some for the extra credit, others for the novelty of a janitor becoming their math mentor. But as the final bell rang and the hallway doors groaned open, the math wing flooded with whispers. "Is it true? She's leading it now? Did you see what she did last week?" Whispers not of doubt, but of awe. Grace Taylor, 46, once a prodigy, once invisible, was now a name spoken with a reverent hush. She stood alone in room 2B, arms crossed, fingers laced with white chalk dust, waiting in front of the board. Not as a janitor, but as a teacher. The classroom was washed in golden light. Dust floated like little comets across the air, catching in the shafts of sunlight from the west-facing windows. Desks had been cleaned, chairs neatly pushed in. She had done that herself, not out of obligation, but ritual. It was her offering. Then, one by one, they entered. At first, 3 boys from sophomore algebra, faces flushed and uncertain. Then, a shy freshman with an oversized backpack. And finally, a dozen more, Some with notebooks, some with phones, all with curiosity. Grace greeted each one softly. She didn't shout. She didn't perform. She simply wrote 3 words on the board in clean, tall letters. Think, test, trust. The class fell silent. I want to start with a question, she said, turning to face them. What's the hardest equation you've ever had to solve? Not in school, but in your life. A pause. No one moved, until Maya Chen, a junior in thick glasses, raised a trembling hand. I guess proving to my parents that I was smart enough, that I mattered. Grace smiled, something warm flickering in her gaze. Good, she said. That's the real math. The kind they don't print in textbooks. Then she reached into her pocket and pulled out a folded sheet. It was the same triple integral from the courtyard last week. But this time, she broke it down slowly, guiding them through the transformations with a gentleness that defied its complexity. As she moved across the board, her motions were fluid, like choreography. One student whispered, "She teaches like she's dancing." But it wasn't just elegance. It was power, earned and quiet. Her voice never rose. But when she said, "Let me show you why it works," the room leaned in, like they were leaning over the edge of something sacred. Midway through the session, a phone buzzed. Grace didn't react. Instead, she walked to the window, pulled open the shade, and let the light wash across the students' faces. "You have to let the light in," she said, "even when it blinds you." Then she turned back and posed a new problem. Harder, twisted, almost cruel. The students groaned. One boy muttered, "No way." Grace paused. Then, in a low, steady voice, she said something no one forgot. Equations are like people. You have to listen long enough before they reveal who they really are. That moment hit like thunder, without sound. Even the fluorescent lights above seemed to dim, as if making room for the reverence. Then came the image action. She reached into the bin beside the desk and lifted out her old janitor's name tag. Slowly, without a word, she walked to the chalk rail and placed it gently on the ledge, beneath the board, like a relic now laid to rest. The class was utterly still. Maya Chen later wrote in her journal, "It felt like a funeral for everything the world had told her she could never be." When the bell rang, no one moved. Then came a voice from the door. "Excuse me, Miss Taylor?" It was Principal Brooks. Behind him, a woman stepped in quietly, Mrs. Martha Ellison. Brooks nodded to the students. "Would you mind giving us the room for a minute?" They filed out slowly, as if leaving a cathedral. Robert Inglison walked in, eyes lowered, holding a worn leather binder. "I thought you might want these," she said. "They're the old department's challenge archives. There's a problem set inside, even I never solved." Grace took the binder, eyes flicking to the initials carved in the leather. She looked up. "I'm not angry," she said quietly. "You saw what you were told to see. But today, maybe, we can both start seeing differently." Martha hesitated. "I'm learning," she said. Grace gave the smallest nod. Not forgiveness, but something close to it. Then she turned back to the board and added one final line. "Solved with courage." You ever seen an entire system hold its breath because someone they dismissed dared to speak in the language they thought she had forgotten? The classroom was empty. Not physically, but spiritually. The kind of emptiness that comes from routine, silence, and unspoken expectations. Until that moment, Grace Taylor, 48, stood before the blackboard. Not to challenge, not to impress, but simply to return to where she belonged. Her fingers, dusted with chalk, trembled, not from fear, but from years of suppression finally loosening their grip. As the final numbers fell into place, the air in the courtyard didn't just shift, it stilled. Then it cracked. And from that crack emerged something no one had prepared for. Awe. The students, once skeptics, now silent, watched her, not as a janitor, not even as a mystery, but as someone reborn before their eyes. Each line she had written wasn't just an equation. It was a quiet rebellion, a reclaiming. The school bell rang, but nobody moved. Behind her, Principal Daniel Brooks broke the silence. "I need someone to lead the math club," he said, his voice steady but low. "And I can't think of anyone better." It wasn't an offer, it was an acknowledgement. Martha Ellison, 61, once the symbol of prestige and gatekeeping, remained on the sidelines. Her arms crossed tighter with each correct step Gracie had written minutes earlier. But now, her stance had softened. She looked older, not by age, but by humility. Grace turned to the principal, her voice calm and fragile, but firm. "I'd like that." Later that week, as flyers went up across Hamilton High, there it was, Math Club Revival, led by Miss Grace Taylor. Her name, on paper, printed in bold, not hidden in payroll files or locker room schedules. She stood before one of those flyers that afternoon, alone in the corridor. No mop, no cart, just herself. Her fingers hovered above the paper, gently touching the corner like it might vanish. That's when Principal Brooks appeared, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened. "I brought something for you," he said, handing her a small manila folder. Inside, a formal recommendation, district approval, and a scholarship offer for continuing education. Grace looked up, her breath catching. "When I left school at 17, she whispered, I promised myself I'd come back someday. I just didn't know how." Brooks nodded. "It's your door, Grace. Always was." And then came the moment that no one predicted. Martha approached, no longer Martha the master, but Martha the humbled. In her arms, a small stack of old math journals. "Some of these techniques," she murmured, "I never fully understood them. Maybe we could talk through them sometime?" Grace smiled. "I'm willing." And in that shared moment of quiet courage, two women from opposite ends of expectation found a new equation, one that included both of them. Later that night, the classroom sat empty. Grace unlocked it gently, stepping inside with no one watching. She placed her chalk on the ledge, and she began to write, not for a prize, not to prove anyone wrong, but because her voice had returned. And this time, the room listened. The school was quiet, not just silent, but hushed, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Night had already crept in through the long hallway windows, smearing streaks of blue and gold across the floor. The janitor's cart stood in the corner, untouched. The mop was dry. The air was still. And in the center of it all, in room 2B, stood Grace Taylor. She didn't wear her uniform tonight. Instead, she had come in a plain navy cardigan and a soft gray blouse, her slacks carefully pressed. The only thing out of place was the thin layer of white dust on her fingertips. Chalk. Always chalk. Before her, the chalkboard loomed, still shadowed by the late afternoon lesson. The day's numbers clung to the board in faded lines, half-erased thoughts that refused to vanish completely. Light from the hallway flickered against the polished tile, as if the building itself wasn't sure if it should still be awake. Ray stepped toward the board with a quiet breath. In her hand, She held the same piece of chalk she had used that first day in the courtyard, the one she'd pocketed when no one was looking, worn, stubby, barely usable, and yet it was enough. She raised her hand. No audience. No students. No phones. No Ellison. Just her. Her arm moved slowly, reverently, as though she were reaching through time to touch the version of herself that had once stood on a stage with a medal, a girl whose dreams had been shelved in exchange for survival. And then she began to write. Not equations. Not proofs. Just one sentence. That's what we want. The mind remembers. The soul returns. The chalk trembled as she finished. It snapped quietly in her fingers. She didn't flinch. Instead, she stepped back, gazing at the board like a painter surveying the last stroke of a piece they didn't know they had the courage to complete. Then she did something that would stay etched into memory for years to come. She walked over to the janitor's cart, pulled the name tag from the side, the one that read Grace T. Custodial Staff, and without ceremony, pinned it to the classroom bulletin board beside the math club poster bearing her full name in bold print. 2 real names, 2 lives, 1 truth. She turned back to the board, now glowing faintly under the last strip of overhead light, and whispered, just loud enough for the walls to remember. This time, I stayed. Behind her, someone watched. Principal Brooks leaned quietly against the door frame, arms folded, eyes soft. He didn't speak. He didn't interrupt. He just nodded once, the smallest sign of respect. And then he left, letting the door close with a gentle click. Grace remembered. She gathered the broken chalk pieces, cupped them in her palms, and placed them in the small ceramic bowl by the window, one she'd brought from home, a place for things that once broke but still held meaning. The room, now empty, felt full, and in the distance, across the glass, the lights of the city shimmered, like thousands of tiny equations waiting to be solved. The next morning, a hush swept over the hallways of Jefferson High. Posters clung to walls like fresh wounds of justice. Flyers announcing the revival of the math club, led by none other than Miss Grace Taylor. Her name no longer scribbled on janitor logs or whispered in passing. It stood in bold letters, surrounded by hand-drawn stars, and the words, "Open to all, no judgment, just curiosity." But what happened next wasn't just academic, it was seismic. By Wednesday, the math club meeting room couldn't hold the flood of students pouring in. Some were math geeks, yes, but others came because something bigger than math had happened. Grace had cracked, not only an equation, but a barrier many didn't realize they were living behind. A quiet movement started. Students talked. Teachers listened. Principal Brooks made a rare appearance that day, standing at the back of the room. His eyes didn't scan for trouble. They rested on Grace. He saw the rows of students sitting in rapt attention, their notebooks open, not because they had to, but because they wanted to. The air felt different, charged. And Grace? She stood by the whiteboard in a simple gray sweater, her hands chalk-dusted, her voice low, deliberate. That day, she didn't just teach math. She spoke of variables, yes, but also of choices, of how life sometimes gives you a complex system to solve, one with no clear path. But that doesn't mean it can't be solved. A student in the front row, Mateo, raised his hand, eyes wide. "Ms. Taylor, do you ever get scared you're not good enough, even when you are?" The class went still. Grace's hand paused mid-equation. Then, slowly, she turned to him and smiled. Not the kind of smile that dismisses, but the kind that holds space. "Yes," she said softly, "all the time. But being scared doesn't mean you're not worthy. It just means you're about to do something that matters." That moment rippled Outside the room, something extraordinary happened. Students had begun organizing. First, they proposed a hallway mural, a timeline of mathematicians from underrepresented backgrounds, with Grace's name at the end. Then came the podcast club, asking to record an episode with her story. Then came local news. On Friday, a local channel aired a short segment titled, "Janitor No More. Grace Taylor rewrites the equation." The next morning, Grace walked into the school and paused. Taped to the inside of her janitor's cart, now nearly empty, was a hand-drawn sign from one of the students. "You clean minds now." She didn't cry, but she did close her eyes. A quiet, powerful pause. Later that week, the school board officially recognized her as a part-time academic staff member. The math department, once cold, offered her a desk, a real one, with her nameplate. And when she walked past Mrs. Ellison in the hallway, the older teacher didn't just nod. She stopped. "I saw the segment last night," Martha said, her voice slower than usual, but more real than it had ever been. "You were magnificent." Grace studied her, then offered a small nod. "I didn't do it to be seen," she said. "I did it to remember who I was." Martha looked away for a second, then back. "Well," she said, "thank you for reminding the rest of us, too." The bell rang. Students surged past them like waves, and Grace stood steady in the center, a chalkboard in motion. And for the first time in years, she felt like a teacher, not just in title, but in spirit. Because when one woman stands quietly for truth, sometimes a whole school sits up and learns. It happened in silence. No cheering crowd, no spotlight, just the sound of chalk gliding across a board, and a woman reclaiming something she never truly lost. In that quiet, room 2B became more than just a classroom. It became a place of return, of quiet power, the kind that doesn't roar. It simply endures. And from that small, steady moment came many more. Fields told their own stories. Teachers started listening again, not to reply, but to understand. The school, once content with appearances, began to shift. Grace Taylor didn't set out to change the system. She only stepped back into herself. But sometimes, that's how revolutions begin. Not with noise, but with presence. She didn't defeat injustice with outrage. She disarmed it with proof. She didn't demand her place. She reminded the world it was already hers. The story of Grace is not just about talent. It's about truth. There are moments in life when the world may try to shrink us, to reduce our identity to a uniform, a title, a mistake, or a silence. But the soul, in its quiet wisdom, remembers what we were born with. Grace Taylor's journey reminds us that we are never too old, too late, or too far removed from purpose. She didn't need the world's permission to matter. She only needed her own. And when she stepped forward, not to prove, but to be, she gave others the courage to do the same. Let this story remind you. The things we bury out of duty or fear can be reclaimed in love. Our greatest acts of justice may come not from protest, but from simply refusing to disappear. If this story touched something in you, please consider subscribing to Racist Stories Uncovered and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. Every story shared brings us closer to a world where dignity isn't a debate, it's a given. With warmth and respect, thank you for walking this path with us. Stay with us, and together, let's keep uncovering the truths that matter. Until next time, from all of us at Racist Stories Uncovered,